Hi, so this is Mr. Cardoso again, and last time we were looking at the basic if-else selection, and we were looking at this video in particular. Um, we were looking at this program, sorry, in particular, where um, we read a mark from the user, and if that mark is greater than or equal to 50, we put is a pass, and if it's not greater than or equal to 50, we put is a fail. Now, a couple of things here just to mention. This is what we call a Boolean statement. A Boolean statement evaluates to true or false. So we are checking to see if something is true or false in the end. For example, we could check to see if two numbers are equal. We could check to see if one number is greater than another number, as in this case. We can check to see if something is greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. So we can do a whole bunch of comparisons with two things to evaluate if they're equal, if they're bigger, if they're smaller, and so on. So we can do lots of checking. Anytime we're checking or comparing two items, that's going to evaluate to a true or a false, or in our flowcharts we use yes or no. That's a Boolean statement. Okay, so let's experiment a little bit more with this. And test it out some more. What happens if we actually enter, we tested a couple of these. So let's enter a mark, let's say 99. That should say is a pass. And it does, because 99 is greater than 50, so it puts as a pass, and then it doesn't do this. Now, let's try, we tried lower numbers as well. Let's say 30. That's going to put is a failure, because 30 is not greater than or equal to 50, so it does not do this, and instead it prints out is a failure. Now let's try what happens if you actually put 50 right on the dot. So I type 50, and it says 50 is a pass. Well, let's see why. 50 is the mark, and is 50 greater than 50? Well, the answer to that is no. But here it says greater than or equal to. And 50, while 50 is not greater than 50, it is equal to 50. So this is true because this is greater than or equal to 50. So we get is a pass. Okay. So just be careful when you're doing these statements. Make sure you're checking the item right on. If this is what we call the borderline, so do a test to make sure that the borderline works the way as planned. Okay. In this case, we do want 50 to be a pass because that's how it does work in our education system. If a student gets 50, they do pass. So therefore it is working according to plan. If we forgot this equal sign and just put greater than 50, then all of a sudden we have a student who has 50, and oh no, 50 is a failure. That's what we call a logical error, because 50 is not a failure. So remember to check to make sure that your borderline values are working according to the logic and how they should be working. Okay, so this was the if-else structure. Of course, we have to have an end if with any if. Now, let's just play around with this some more. Let's say I forgot the else. Okay, and I'm going to take this out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it down here. So now, what I have is if the mark is greater than or equal to 50, then put mark is a pass. You don't have to have an else. Else is optional, okay? So sometimes if you want to do something, if this is true, then you want to put is a pass, and then if it's not true, you want to do something else, then you must have an else. But sometimes you don't have to have an else. So let's see what happens now. This is not within an else block. This is just out there. So let's see what happens if we put a mark in. So let's put a mark greater than 50. Let's say 95. In this case now, we get 95 is a pass and 95 is a failure. Well, obviously this is not working how we want it to work, because what's happening is here is it says if the mark, which in this case is 95, is greater than or equal to 50, so 95 is greater than or equal to 50, so then we say put 95 is a pass. So that's why we get this line here. Then the if is ended. Now this line gets printed or happens no matter what. This will always happen. So that's why we get 95 is a failure. If we don't want that to happen, we only want that to happen if this is not true, then that's when we use the else. So let's edit undo here and put things back the way they were. So just to give you another example of that, we can say put goodbye, thanks for using my program. Now this line, of course, will get run no matter what. It's not inside the if, else, and if block. It's not within the selection. So this gets run all the time, anytime you run the program. So if I put in a mark higher, like 95, let's say 95 is a pass, goodbye, thanks for using my program, that gets run. If I put in a mark that is lower, let's say 10, now we get 10 as a failure, and we still get goodbye, thanks for using my program. So this line happens only when this is true. This line happens only when this is false. And this line happens all the time because it's not within the selection block. Okay. And these lines happen all the time as well, for that matter, because they're not within the selection block. Okay. Now, what if you wanted more options? What if it's just not pass or fail? In this case, we only have 2 ways to go out of our decision diamond. So what if we had multiple ways of going, or multiple selection? So now we're going to talk about multiple selection. Okay. So let's try saying, for example, if the mark is greater than 80, greater than or equal to 80, then let's say mark is an A. Okay. Now we want to put another condition, because there's more than just 2 now. There's lots of letter grades, A, B, C. Let's put A, B, C, D, and F. Okay. So if we do that, we have to use the special keyword that's else if. And notice for else if, I'm going to delete the E and put in IF. And notice that that still comes out as a keyword. So now here I'm going to put else if, and with an else if, you must have another condition. Only else is allowed to not have a condition. Else if, on the other hand, because it has the keyword if again, must have another condition. So now I'm going to say mark is greater than or equal to 70, then put mark is a D. Now, let's just pause here for a second. The reason why I don't have to say is mark greater than or equal to 70 and less than 80 is because if it was greater than 80 to begin with, it would have done this and kicked out to the end if. Because we get to this point, because we even get to this point, we know for a fact that mark is less than 80. Okay, there's no way for mark to be greater than or equal to 80, because if it was greater than or equal to 80, it would have put an A, and then it would have jumped to the end if. It would not have looked at all of the other situations or conditions. Okay, so let's continue. Then we have else if mark is greater than or equal to 60, then put mark, comma, is a C. Else if mark is greater than or equal to 50, then put mark is a D. And now finally, since there's no other condition, if it's not an A, it's not B, it's not C, and it's not a D, I don't have to say if mark is less than 50. There's no other condition than a failure, than an F, or a failure. So I'll just put else in this case. In my last one, for all other conditions, I can put mark is an F. Okay, so now in this case, you know, if one of these conditions are true, it will go in to that block. If none of these conditions are true, then it comes to this one, the else block. So this happens if none of these other ones evaluate to true. That's how I know there's no other case. If it's not an A, it's not a B, it's not a C, and it's not a D, it has to be an F. And then of course I have to have an end if to end my if structure. Okay, so let's run this. Let's test it out. Let's put in a high mark. That should be an A. So let's try 85. And we say 85 is an A. Let's try putting 80 on the dot. That should give us an A as well. Okay, good. Now when you're testing selection, it's a good idea to try and test all of your possible pathways. So in this case, let's try 70. That should print a B. Good. Okay. Let's try 60. That should print a C. And let's try 50. That should print D. It does. And then finally, let's try anything else, which is 45, and it should print an F. What if we enter -5, even though we know that's not possible for a mark? Since -5 is not greater than any of these, it should come down and print an F. So it falls into the else category. Okay, so just to reiterate again, what's actually happening here is what we call lazy evaluation. And if blocks, if-else-if blocks use lazy evaluation, meaning if one of them is true, as soon as Turing finds that one of the Boolean statements evaluates to true, it does those body statements, and then it jumps out to the end. It doesn't go through line by line with the rest of the conditions. It will only continue if this evaluates to false. Okay, so let's look at an example where the mark is, let's say right now the mark equals 65. So the mark is 65, sorry, that was supposed to be a comment. If the mark is 65, okay, then let's trace through this selection, which is what you should do when you're programming. Is 65 greater than or equal to 80? No, it is not. So it doesn't do this. It moves on, and it checks the next condition. Is 65 greater than or equal to 70? The answer there again is no. So it does not do this, and it moves on to the next condition until it finds one that is true. Is 65 greater than or equal to 60? Yes, it is. So now it puts this to the screen. It actually executes this statement. And because this was true, it found one that's true, and because it's lazy evaluation, it quits now and comes down here, jumps down here. It does not evaluate any of the rest of it, of the conditions. Okay? So that's how lazy evaluation works with if and else if.